I recently had this weird phase where I became really interested in American politics and all the mess that it entails, and I wanted to understand it further from a seasoned politician's perspective. So I read A Promised Land by Barack Obama, and one of my biggest takeaways was that Obama is so knowledgeable about a variety of topics, from the history of the Middle East to climate change policy to US-China relations. And I think a big reason that attributes to this is because Obama is a voracious reader. Recently, he dropped his book recommendations for the summer of 2021. So as someone who aspires to have even half of Obama's intellectual capacity, and just as someone who wants to read more, I decided to read through every single book on President Obama's summer reading list. Without further ado, here are all of the books that I will be reading. At Night, All Blood is Black by David Diop. Land of Big Numbers by T-Ping Chen. Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. Project Hail Mary by Indy Weir. Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert. Things We Lost to the Water by Eric Nguyen. Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris. And Intimacies by Kitamura. I currently have only around a month or so of my summer break remaining, so I don't have a lot of time, and I'm going to challenge myself to read all of these books in just 2 weeks. And if you do the math, that calculates to around 230 pages a day, which is a bare minimum of 4 hours. So definitely a lot of reading. So just like that, we are off to day 1 of our 2-week summer reading challenge. I got At Night, All Blood is Black loaded up on the iPad mini Kindle reader, and without further ado, let's get reading. I just finished reading At Night, All Blood is Black by David Diop. I'm going to talk more about this book later in my book review at the end of this video. The thing that really stood out to me about this book was how well David Diop used prose to convey the savagery and brutality of war. I'm still a little bit confused about what happened in the end. There's a lot to unpack within just 160 pages of this book, so I'm gonna have to do a little bit of deeper dive later on, but for now I'm gonna continue on the challenge and start reading Land of Big Numbers by T-Ping Chen. Currently the morning of day 2, and I just finished reading 4 chapters of Land of Big Numbers, still have a lot to go. But I just wanted to say that this book reminds me so much of the Netflix series Black Mirror, in that every chapter is unique and independent, and each chapter is more and more eerie than the previous one. Black Mirror just so happens to be one of my favorite shows on Netflix, so I'm really excited to see where this book will go. So I just finished reading The Land of Big Numbers by T-Ping Chen, and overall my thoughts are that it's a good collection of short stories, though some of the stories were a little bit slower paced and didn't provide enough closure, but some of them, like the last one especially, provided a lot of unique insight, and they were incredibly captivating. Currently at a graduation party, and the program has kind of stalled for now. I'm done with my dinner, which is really good, and now I think I'm just gonna do some little bit of reading of Empire of Pain. Yeah, I'm that type of person that would do the challenge at a grad party. Oh well. Here's a bit what the grad party looks like, by the way. It is currently day 3 of the challenge, and I'm around 20% done with Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. I just wanted to say that this book is absolutely fantastic. It's an utter page-turner. It recounts the story of the Sackler family, who were large pioneers in the pharmaceutical advertising industry, and they made a lot of money selling highly addictive drugs to people. This book is pretty big. It's around 550 pages. So we'll see how much of it I can get through tonight. If not tonight, I hope to be able to finish it by tomorrow morning. The time is now 12:25 a.m. and I'm 2/3 of the way done with Empire of Pain. I've been reading for a few hours today, though a bit on and off. I'm done with part 1 and part 2, and I'll probably be finishing up part 3 by tomorrow morning. I just wanted to echo what I said earlier on today, in that Empire of Pain is truly a tremendous book. Probably one of my favorite nonfiction books that I've read this year, and perhaps even of all time. It reminds me a little bit of The Wolf of Wall Street, except instead of selling pink sheets and penny stocks, they're selling OxyContin and other addictive drugs that can literally kill people. Day 4 of the challenge, and I just had a bit of a revelation. So reading, because it's something that you do actively rather than passively, requires that you have motivation, which comes with momentum. So in order to build momentum, you want to have long stretches of time in which you can continuously read. What you don't want to have are interruptions in between that kill your momentum, and every time your momentum is killed, you have to rebuild that again through basically climbing a steep hill and forcing yourself to push through that hill and start reading. This is a bit different from a sentiment echoed within The Empire of Pain, the book that I've just been reading. Because what The Empire of Pain talks about is that drugs are highly addictive when they have highs and lows, peaks and troughs. If you're feeling super high at one moment, but then suddenly you're feeling super low, you're more incentivized to take that drug at the low point. That's almost the exact opposite of reading. Because with reading, when you're at that low point, you struggle to keep reading. Your momentum is not built. That leads me to say that I think this week might not have been the best week to start this challenge, because every single day so far in the middle of the afternoon, I've had something to go to, which disrupts my flow. So I think the challenge is almost good for me, because without it, I wouldn't have this added incentive to keep reading, and it would be much more difficult for me to pick up that book and actually start. But anyway, rambling aside, I'm actually gonna start finishing Empire of Pain now. I just finished up reading Empire of Pain. As you can see, it's nighttime, and it took me quite a while to finish the third section, which was basically about the Sackler family getting sued by a bunch of agencies and them having to fight back against the lawsuits. Overall, very good book, though I think he could have shortened it down a little bit. Instead of maybe 560 pages, it could have been something like 460 pages. The next book I'm planning on reading is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, which is the second 500 pager out of the 10-page book list, and I hope to finish that book by maybe 2 days from now. I've got two new exciting pieces of news today. Number one is I got this brand new camera that I'm currently using, if you couldn't tell. And number two is I'm 300 pages down of the absolute masterpiece of the book that is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. For context, Andy Weir also wrote the book The Martian, which was adapted into the movie, and The Martian is one of my favorite movies of all time. But this book, Project Hail Mary, I love it for two reasons. First is it's a sci-fi thriller about a man who is racing the clock to try to save humanity from global cooling. Yeah, cooling, not warming, global cooling. And second, this book really helped reinforce some of the concepts that I learned throughout science classes in high school, such as centrifugal force, reference frames, jet stream, and how solar radiation works in space. So just like that, it's the afternoon of day 6, but I am done with Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. As I said before, it is truly an amazing, amazing book. I recommend it to anybody, especially people who are interested in sci-fi, physics, space exploration, aliens, things like that. It's truly an amazing book. The next book that I'll be reading is Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert. And funny thing is, I think this book is actually about climate change, or has to do with the environment. And so did Project Hail Mary, which I find is a pretty funny coincidence. The good news is I am done with both of the 500 pagers on my book list. Everything else, the maximum was only around 300 pages, so it should take a lot less time to read. And that means that I'm on pace to finishing the challenge in 2 weeks. And just like that, it's the afternoon of day 7, and I'm done reading Under White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert, meaning I'm 5 books down in 7 days, which means I am perfectly on pace. Here are some of my thoughts about Under the White Sky. One thing that I really like about it, diagrams. Look at this neat diagram of a coral reef. As much as I like Project Hail Mary, the book had almost 0 diagrams, except for like a few at the very beginning, and that made it a little bit difficult sometimes to conceptualize some of the more abstract things that Andy Weir was talking about. So for future book writers out there, if you're going to talk about complex things, give diagrams. They're very, very useful. One thing that I'm doing a lot with Under White Sky that I'm not doing as much with other books is highlighting. And the reason for this is because Under White Sky contains a lot of both storytelling narration, as well as science and engineering concepts. And I'm mainly highlighting those science and engineering concepts because that is my purpose of reading the book. I want to know what sort of feats and advancements in engineering are being taken to save the environment. And that just appeals to me as a science and engineering person myself. I'm not as interested in the relationships that Kolbert builds while meeting people to learn about the core race. That just doesn't interest me as much. It's not really the purpose why I'm reading this book. That leads me to say that I think it's really important to come into a book knowing what is your purpose behind reading your book. Is it just to learn about new science and technology advancements? Is it to entertain yourself and to read for fun? Is it because you want to learn about a mythical world and the creatures that are involved in this mythical world? What is your purpose? Because once you know that purpose, you're much more likely to gain a lot more from this book. You're more likely to be satisfied. And that's because a good book, successful authors generally appeal to a broad audience, and you yourself, you lie within a small subset of that audience. Your interests, your hobbies are different from other people. If you have a purpose, then you know specifically what from this book you're trying to get at. And once you finish that book with this purpose in mind, you know how much the book has informed you about what you wanted, and you can go to further materials and resources to continue learning about things that you're interested in. It's getting a little bit late, but I'm around a third of the way done with Things We Lost to the Water by Nguyen. I haven't been really reading that much today. I said I was gonna read at like 1 p.m., but then YouTube recommended a series of Simon Sinek videos to me, and then I just got hooked for some reason and just procrastinated by watching Simon Sinek videos for most of the day. So I haven't done a lot of reading of Things We Lost to the Water. Fortunately, it's a really quick read. And it's also a pretty good book, so I should be able to finish it by tomorrow. But anyways, something that Simon Sinek said earlier really resonated with me, which is that if you want to become successful, it can't just be what you do, it has to be why you do it. And that's because if you face burden, if you face challenges or failure along the way, and you don't have a specific why for what you're doing, then you're less likely to overcome that burden because you don't have a long-term vision of what you want to do. And I think that especially relates to such a tough challenge like this one, reading 10 books in 14 days. Because if there's even one misstep, one bump along the road, it's really easy just to give up entirely. And now that I've thought about that, I'm reflecting a little bit into why I'm doing this challenge for real. And I think it's really because I want to build a variety of different perspectives around the world. Obama recommended so many genres of books in this list, from nonfiction in Empire of Pain to sci-fi in Project Hail Mary, and now to a novel about immigrants from Vietnam in Things We Lost to the Water. And I think by implementing the things that these characters have learned in these books, and knowing and becoming aware of the failures that certain people have faced and how they overcame these failures and able to build upon themselves, I can implement those lessons learned from these books in my own life, and as a result become a better person myself. And I think that's the most valuable thing that I can acquire from reading such a large variety of books. I just finished reading Things We Lost to the Water by Nguyen, which was Nguyen's first ever novel, and it was an excellent, excellent read. I didn't think I was going to be this invested in this book right after I read the synopsis, but hey, I was mistaken. It was very, very captivating, and I finished it in just 2 sittings, which just comes to show you that not only should you not judge a book by its cover, but you also shouldn't judge it by its summary. Anyways, the next book that I'm going to read is Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. I'm literally 10 pages in to Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam, and I just feel the need to rant about this, but this man uses so many descriptors in this book. It is on the point where I am like almost frustrated because literally every single sentence has the exact same structure. It's they see this, they interact with this, followed by just a string of like 10 clauses filled with descriptors. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, what is about to happen? This book is only like 250 pages long, and I feel like 90% of it is descriptors and 10% of it's plot. Like, Rumaan, just write, man. Just hurry up with the plot. I don't need to hear so many descriptors about one house, one room. Alright, I just finished reading Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam, and I've got to say, this book did not do it for me. I didn't like it. The plot is very broken in that there's some rising action, but then the book ends right in the middle of the rising action. This innately is a horror story, meaning that there is something really eerie happening to our characters, but we don't know why this eerie thing is occurring in the first place. And we also don't know what happens to our characters at the end of the day. So there's no resolution, there's no closure, and ultimately, because of that, I'm left unsatisfied after reading this book. Now don't get me wrong, this book is for some people. If you like really dystopian stories, if you like eerie settings, if you like horror and you like scary things happening to our characters, then this book may put you on the edge of your seat. But personally, it was just not my cup of tea. The next book that I'm going to be reading is Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. I just checked my book list and there are fewer than 1,000 pages left in our challenge. So hopefully I can finish this book by today, and then tomorrow and the day after that, I finish the rest of the 2 books and challenge is over and we finish early. I just finished reading Kazuo Ishiguro's Klara and the Sun, and I really enjoyed it. This book talks about this artificial friend, or artificial intelligence, known as Klara, and her relationship with this girl named Josie who's getting more and more ill as the book progresses. I think for me, the strongest part of this book has to be the characters, and that each of them has a concrete, unique identity, a set of personalities that Kazuo Ishiguro doesn't deviate from, but they're all extremely dynamic. In that, as the book continues, they all go through this arc, which keeps me invested in this novel, even though the plot is not very complex. It's a very simple plot. Like most Kazuo Ishiguro books, Klara and the Sun takes place in a dystopian society, one that's pretty classist, and that some people in the upper class are known as lifted, and they possess unique advantages that people in lower classes who are unlifted don't have. Overall, if you're looking for an enjoyable, pretty simple read, but one that's really invested in these characters, I strongly recommend Klara and the Sun. The next book that I'm going to be reading is The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris, and I hope to get a good chunk of that done by tonight. So it's actually been a few days. I've been caught up recently with some college work, as well as I've been listening to this new audiobook called How We Sleep by Matthew Walker, which is not part of the Obama reading list, but it still really interested me because I was like curious about my sleep cycles and how I could sleep better. But anyways, I just finished reading The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris, and although I didn't enjoy as much as some of the other fiction books, it was still a very enjoyable read. I typically don't read too much historical fiction, so this was a pretty welcome surprise. Its main premise surrounds these 2 emancipated slaves who find employment at this white family in southern Georgia. But because this white family treats these 2 slaves relatively well compared to how other people would treat them in Georgia, this white family actually faces a lot of repercussions and backlash from the white community. Overall, the book was a little bit slower paced than I wanted it to be. However, the slow pace didn't really distract from the enticing and exciting parts of the plot. The final book that I will read is Intimacies by Kitamura. And just like that, I am officially done with the challenge. I just wrapped up Kitamura's Intimacies. This book was a really quick read. I finished it in one sitting in just over 2 hours. It was a really good book, even though it was less plot heavy. It was really invested in its characters and the relationships between the different characters. It specifically focuses on the narrator, who is this translator, and her relationships with both the person who she's translating for, which is this former president of an African country who's committed crimes against humanity against his own people, as well as her relationship with her lover, who is actually engaged in a really complicated marriage of his own. So now that I'm done with the challenge, let's get on with the book rankings. So now that I've given all 10 books a read, I'm going to rate them from S, A, B, C, D, and F, with S being the best and F being the worst. At first, we have At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop, which takes us through the story of Alpha, a young Senegalese fighter who's fighting for France, who slowly descends into madness after losing his best friend. The way Diop conveys Alpha's increasingly savage mentality really lures the reader into the story. The second half of the story primarily concerns Alpha's backstory, though the ending is pretty confusing and leaves the reader wondering whose point of view the story is really being told from. Overall, At Night All Blood is Black gets a B tier rating for me. Next is Land of Big Numbers by Chen, which is a collection of 10 short stories revolving around people of Chinese descent. Each story serves to highlight some aspect of the Chinese government, Chinese culture, or just the Chinese identity as a whole. Although some stories were incredibly riveting, particularly the last one, others fall just a little bit flat for me. And this is because they either don't have a developed plot or because the characters don't experience some sort of meaningful arc. Overall, Land of Big Numbers falls in the C tier for me, which is still good, but not as compelling as some of the other books. Empire of Pain by Radden Keefe is our first non-fiction book and takes us through the history of the Sackler family, who made a fortune off of producing, marketing, and selling highly addictive, pain-relieving drugs. From Arthur Sackler and Valium to Richard Sackler and OxyContin, The Empire of Pain is brutally honest with the deceitful tactics that the Sacklers used to sell their drugs, which ultimately spurred the modern-day opioid crisis. The story resembles a combination of Narcos and The Wolf of Wall Street. It is so compelling, and for that reason, it is an A tier for me. Just when I thought it couldn't get much better, Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir proved me wrong because this book is about as good as science fiction will get. It is pure action and entertainment, following the story of Ryland Grace, who's the school teacher turned astronaut who is literally racing against the clock to save planet Earth. The book is so elaborate about Ryland Grace's thought process, showing us how he conducts these fascinating science experiments and how he even manages to form an unlikely ally on his journey. I'm so excited for the movie adaptation of Project Hail Mary, but as is, this book will get my only S tier rating on this list. Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert details a variety of different environmental issues that the Earth is facing, as well as solutions that scientists are taking to solve them. As informative as this book was, Kolbert's writing style failed to keep me engaged consistently. A lot of the key ideas were lost in her dragged out narration and stories about her different excursions, and I also didn't think Kolbert elaborated nearly enough about the scientific advancements as other books such as How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates did. If you're passionate about sustainability and you don't mind prolonged narratives, you will love this book, but for me, it's a C tier. Eric Nguyen's debut novel Things We Lost to the Water follows a Vietnamese family, namely a mother and her two sons, who immigrated to New Orleans seeking a new life following the Vietnam War. Each member of this family took drastically different paths in life despite living together for the better part of their lives, and I absolutely loved following their character arcs. Moreover, as an Asian American myself, I really appreciated how this book explored racism and xenophobia against Asian Americans in a really raw and authentic way, while also dispelling common stereotypes. So overall, this book will get an A tier for me. In my opinion, Leave the World Behind by Rumaan was probably the weakest book in this list. It feels less like a novel and more a random assortment of weird events, starting with this blackout in New York City and ending with these loud, thunderous booming noises. It kind of reminds me of like the feel of a first episode of a 10-part horror TV show, rather than a complete story in and out of itself. Elam manages to stuff the book with unnecessary plot details, many of them weirdly graphic, which distracts from the story itself. Although some parts, like the buildup of tension and cataclysmic events, kept me somewhat entertained, the lack of closure ultimately left me unsatiated, and for that, I gave it a D tier rating. Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro is the most emotionally gripping book on Obama's summer reading list. It follows the story of Klara, who's this robotic, artificial friend to this girl named Josie. Through this book, it is really clear why Kazuo Ishiguro won his Nobel Prize in Literature for, quote, uncovering the abyss beneath our illusory sense of connection with the world. In other words, Kazuo Ishiguro's novels help us understand fundamental things about life that we often take for granted. And through the relationships that he cultivates in Klara and the Sun, he helps to answer the deceptively simple question, what does it mean to love someone? Ishiguro tackles this question from numerous different perspectives, such as, is it possible to truly overcome the loss of a loved one? What risks would we take for the people that we love? And what is so special about the people that we love? Ishiguro is an incredibly skilled writer, and his masterpiece Klara and the Sun can help us all navigate the world and understand each other all just a little bit better. And for that, it is an A tier. The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris, which is also Oprah's book club pick, revolves around the intersection between two emancipated slaves and this white family in Old Ox, Georgia, who are against slavery in the Confederacy. The book sheds light both on the rampant racism in the South against African Americans after the Civil War, as well as the heroism of white abolitionists who stood up against racial oppression. Although the book started and ended a bit slow for me, the character development and rising to action were both excellent. And as a result, I gave it a B tier. Finally, Katie Kitamura's book, Intimacies, takes us through the relationships that an unnamed narrator builds to help her navigate through a new city that she's living in. I'm sure many of the people who read this book will be able to relate to this narrator, as she faces both workplace pressure translating for this nefarious dictator in court, knowing that a mistranslation may result in horrible consequences, as well as a romantic relationship pressure with someone who is trying to divorce his wife but also not really at the same time. However, one thing that weirdly bothered me about this book was the punctuation. Kitamura is a Princeton graduate and holds a PhD in American literature, so I doubt this was intentional, but she never used quotation marks for dialogue, and she often misused commas to the point where it distracted from the actual writing itself. Despite these faults, however, I still give Intimacies a B tier rating. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe down below. Reading these books all took a lot of effort, so I'd really appreciate your help. If you made it this far in the video, you were a real one. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace out.